Coming to you from the shores of gorgeous Lake Michigan, welcome to the National Writers Series, celebrating 15 years as a year-round book festival and the premier home for passionate readers who love inspiring conversations with award-winning authors. Tonight, we welcome #1 New York Times bestselling author Jeanine Cummins. Jeanine Cummins' newest novel, Speak to Me of Home, is a sweeping, multi-generational story that follows 3 women, Rafaela, her daughter Ruth, and her granddaughter Daisy, as they search for belongings across decades of continents. Set between Puerto Rico and the American Midwest, the novel explores identity, family, and the meaning of home. Cummins is also the author of #1 New York Times bestseller, American Dirt, a global phenomenon that has sold over 4 million copies and has been translated into 40 languages. The book was an Oprah's Book Club pick and a Barnes & Noble Book Club pick. Jeanine Cummins will be joined by our guest host, Beth Milligan, a journalist and head writer for the Traverse City Ticker, with a background in marketing and PR for numerous organizations, like Up North Pride and the Traverse City Film Festival. She co-hosts currently with Crystal Frost podcast and serves on several community advisory boards and committees while living on a small hobby farm on Old Mission Peninsula. The National Writers Series salutes our amazing audiences, dedicated volunteers, and generous supporters for helping us raise the next generation of readers and writers through our free education programs across the region. This season of amazing authors is made possible through major support by the Green Brick Foundation, Northgard Technology Group, Golden Fowler Home Furnishings, Prout Financial, and Ward and Mary Bevins Gillette. Tonight's event is underwritten by Judy and Bruce Bayless, Susan and Chuck Cady, and Lola Jackson and Dillis Tostason Garcia. Tonight's live streaming is exclusively underwritten by Nancy Davey. Thanks to our major media sponsor, the Traverse City Record Eagle, and our media partner, Interlochen Public Radio. For information on future events, programs, and how to support our nonprofit work, please visit nationalwritersseries.org. Now, please welcome to the stage #1 New York Times bestselling author, Doug Stanton.
Thank you. Hi, Donnie. My job is very brief tonight. We're so pleased to have Jeanine and Beth here. They're about to sit in these wonderful chairs. I want to say a few things, though. Jeanine was nice enough today to come to the Front Street Writers Program and speak to our students, and it was an amazing conversation. You are such a wonderful teacher, and she changed lives today, and you're changing lives with your support. So your support helped her go there. And Ms. Crouch, where are you? She's our intern, and she was a Front Street Writers 4 years ago. Now she's a creative writing major at Grand Valley, and she called Ann Stanton, who was up here earlier, and asked to intern this summer. So now she's interning here at the Writers Series after having been a student in the program that someone like Jeanine was mentoring. So it's a full circle, and we're so glad that you're here. It's a fascinating conversation tonight about a beautiful novel and a beautiful writer. Thank you, Miriam Pico. You were in the back there singing. Everyone around. Oh, there you are. Thank you, volunteers. All of you with the lanyards, you've been here sometimes for over a decade. Thank you so much. And also on the website, we have adult fiction writing courses for the first time available. So if you go to the website, you can sign up for those. And also the new children's, or not children's, but the young writers courses are available too on the website. So without further ado, please welcome Jeanine Cummins and Beth Milligan to the stage.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for that beautiful welcome. Before we get started, I want to say thank you to Miriam for the beautiful music, and I'm so happy that you're here this evening. It was really lovely.
And we were saying, so you have been to the UP before, but this is your first time in Traverse City, right?
Yes, and I'm going to stay forever. I'm going to send for my dogs. And my family.
I would say you came at the right time of year, because you saw the bay last night. You mentioned it kind of reminded you of home, and you're like, I'm getting my family, I'm coming back.
Yes, I love it here. It's beautiful. Yeah.
Well, we're excited you're here. Originally, there was a hope that Ann Patchett was going to do this interview tonight, and trust me that I know I'm a poor substitute for Ann Patchett. She couldn't make it work. She is, I think, working on a new book, though, which is exciting. But I did have a chance to talk with Ann in Nashville recently while I was visiting her bookstore, and she told me that she loves this book. On Instagram, she said, "I think this book is going to be huge. It's a big, loving, sprawling, multi-generational book. Think pachinko. It's the kind of thing that you're just going to sink into and really enjoy." And then she said, "Jeanine, I'm so happy for you rising up from the ashes and doing something fantastic."
I love Anne.
She's amazing.
Yeah. Thank you.
So we'll maybe get a little later into the rising up from the ashes part of what Anne said.
Yes.
But we're gonna start with the new book. So you said that Speak to Me of Home draws heavily from people and experiences in your own family, your roots in Puerto Rico. So maybe to set the stage tonight, could you tell us a little bit about what the story is about and some of the key people and experiences in your family that helped shape it?
Yes. So my grandmother was born and raised in Santurce, Puerto Rico, in San Juan, and she is the prototype for the matriarch of the family that you'll read about in Speak to Me of Home. This story is about 3 generations of women in this family, beginning with Rafaela, who is based on my grandmother Maria, but she is not my grandmother Maria. She's much nicer than Maria, and I would say more resilient. And then her daughter is Ruth, who spends her childhood back and forth between St. Louis and Puerto Rico, which was the experience of my father. He grew up between the 2 places. And then Ruth's daughter is Daisy, and Daisy occupies the 3rd generation position, the granddaughter. And Daisy has some of the experiences that my siblings and I had growing up, where we felt always very, very proud of our Puerto Rican heritage and would insist on it in ways that we were like, "We're Puerto Rican!" And then sometimes our dad would be like, Are you sure about that?" So it's really the sort of interplay between the 3 generations and how they all have a very different relationship to their identity. And they love each other very much, but they don't have a shared vocabulary about how to talk about belonging and their ethnicity. In my family, we did not talk about race. It was a factor. It was a major factor in the way that my father experienced his identity, which, by the way, was a word that my father never uttered once in his entire life, I don't think. But to be sure, when my grandmother moved from Puerto Rico to St. Louis and had 8 kids in a place that felt somewhat hostile to her, all she wanted was for her kids to pass. She just wanted for them to assimilate, for them to be white. And in some ways, she was sort of successful in ushering them into that life. But she did not understand the cost of that. She didn't understand the shame that her children were growing up ingesting. And so there is a generational sort of inheritance that was unintended by that relationship with identity. So the circumstances of my grandmother's life were that she was born into a very well-to-do family, a very wealthy family in San Juan, where they had live-in servants. And when she was a teenage girl, her father lost their fortune, like all of it, like in a minute. Everything changed. And Maria she was sent to Trinidad to get a job on a US naval base when she was 16. And that's where she met my Irish-American grandfather, who was from St. Louis, married him, moved to St. Louis, had 8 kids. My dad was the oldest. Those are the exact same circumstances of Rafaela's life, but they're very different women. And one of the great joys of writing this novel for me was that it allowed me to imagine a different life for my grandmother. My grandmother was very unhappy for the rest of her days. I think she had a hard time accepting her adulthood. she could never become accustomed to people in this country treating her like a Puerto Rican. It was painful for her. And she sort of walked around with a real bitter weight, sort of saying to people, "Don't you know who I am?" And she felt so deeply misunderstood. And she really passed a lot of that anger on to her kids. And so it was a great joy and a great liberation to write the character who came from the same circumstances as Maria, but to provide her with different options. Like, what if she had contraception, for example?
Always one of the big questions.
That would have been a game changer. I think among the many reasons my grandmother was angry, she was like, why do I have all of these kids? There's so many of them. And she had no help. She was entirely isolated. She had no family in the United States. And she was confronted with prejudice every day of her life. So she was extremely isolated, and that is no way to try to raise 8 kids. So, as I keep saying, it was a great joy to imagine a different outcome for her, and that's kind of where this novel came from.
How many people here have been to Puerto Rico in the room? Oh, quite a
Yay.
few. That's awesome.
Plenty of you still get to go for the first time. Lucky you guys.
I mean, I'm among those who have not been yet, but I will say your descriptions of Puerto Rico are so beautiful and evocative in the book, it will make you want to book a flight there immediately.
Yay.
So I wondered, what is your relationship with Puerto Rico like, and what was important for you to capture about Puerto Rico in the book?
So growing up, I didn't visit Puerto Rico. We didn't travel. I mean, my dad was in the Navy, so we traveled when we moved, which was frequently. But as far as having vacations, they usually involved a tent and a lot of dirt. There was never like getting on an airplane and going somewhere. So it wasn't until my early adulthood that I went back to Puerto Rico for the first time. I grew up in a very diverse and incredibly integrated city in Maryland. That's a suburb of Washington, D.C. And I describe my childhood as being almost a post-racial experience. My friends were from every different background. I was never in a room with only white people until I went to college. And the first time I found myself in a room like that, I felt very uncomfortable. And that was the first time that I had to sort of face that the way that I perceived myself was very different from the way other people perceived me. And so I started grappling with the questions about identity around that time in my life, 18, 19 years old. And I've been doing that ever since. My identity is messy, and I think that's beautiful. I think that is true for so many people in this country. And it's complicated, and I wanted to unpack it a little bit in ways that my dad was never comfortable doing. So I started going back to Puerto Rico. I love Puerto Rican food, and in some ways, it was a blessing that my Puerto Rican grandmother did not cook, because I would be much fatter if she did. But we don't have any recipes, and this is a running theme in the book, that the grandmother character does not cook. And it was important for me to actually include that detail, because food is a very important element of the way cultural heritage gets passed down. And that was one more way that root was broken in my family. And I'm sad that I don't have more Puerto Rican recipes, but I cook Puerto Rican food for my kids. I always say my kids are not fluent in Spanish, but they are fluent in Bad Bunny. So they are growing up with a lot more Puerto Rican customs, traditions, music in the house than I did, because I did not grow up with the shame.
There's a scene in the book where a character's U.S. insurance doesn't work in Puerto Rico, and I know that does not sound like it would be the most pivotal scene in the book, but I think it illustrates a reality for many Puerto Ricans, which is that, it's a U.S. territory, Puerto Ricans are U.S. citizens, but often we here on the mainland don't remember that, first of all, or don't know it. And often kind of treat Puerto Rico as second class. They don't have the ability to vote in our elections. They don't have representation in Congress, although many people, including myself, think they should. So I'm curious, what do you make of our relationship here on the mainland to Puerto Rico?
It's terrible. I mean, so the question of status for Puerto Rico is like the most important political consideration for the archipelago. It always has been. And it is a question that I do not feel qualified to have an opinion about because I don't live on the island. There are three options: statehood, Commonwealth, which is the status quo, or independence. And the three political parties in Puerto Rico, it is like the national sport. People feel very strongly about it. And it's fascinating listening to people talk about the different options and why they believe that their way is the best. And I have feelings about it, but I don't have an opinion because I would not lose my United States passport, for example, if Puerto Rico became independent. But I do believe that Puerto Rico has the inalienable right to sovereignty, to be self-governing, and in many ways that's not happening for Puerto Rico right now. In most meaningful ways, it's not happening for Puerto Rico right now, and it has never happened. But I will say that there is something subversive going on in Puerto Rican culture where they are like killing it in the arts and punching so far above their weight. This tiny island is producing the most amazing artists and musicians and writers. And it feels, despite, or maybe because of being a place that has been so heavily oppressed forever, and the colonial relationship, frankly, that it maintains with the United States, or vice versa. I'm so proud of what Puerto Rico has been able to accomplish within the constraints of that relationship.
That in-between status that Puerto Ricans experience is something that many migrants and immigrants have felt, of not fully belonging in one place or not fully being in one or the other. And you write in the book of one of the characters, she both belonged and did not belong at all, no matter where she was. You were born in Spain to a Puerto Rican father. You said that you originally spoke Spanish. You've spoken about the frustration of being criticized early in your life for not speaking English well enough, and now as an adult for not speaking Spanish well enough. So what's your own experience like having the in-between identity?
I mean, it's this book. I do think that this is a very common refrain for lots of people who are from one place but don't live there. My husband is from Ireland, and we live in New York, and he is, in New York, he is never going to, he's an American citizen now, a United States citizen, but he will always be considered Irish in New York, which is nothing but a benefit to him, by the way, because when he gets pulled over, every cop's like, my grandmother's from Cork. It's not a problem. But when we go back to Ireland to visit his parents and his siblings, he's American. He's the Yank. They call him the Yank. And it's funny, but there's an edge there where he no longer belongs anywhere. And that is an edge that I think I've always had. My parents were both more or less raised in St. Louis. And I was born in Spain, and we moved to all these different places before I was, 6 or 7 years old. Then I grew up mostly in Gaithersburg, Maryland. Then I moved to Ireland for 2 years. Then I moved to New York. People ask me where I'm from, and I'm like, how much time do we have? It's like a really long story. And I frequently make a joke out of it, but it has been a difficult question for me, and sometimes comes with like a little pang of feeling, because I don't have a good answer for it. Where am I from? I don't know.
And you and I had a chance to talk a little bit before the event, and you had mentioned that this felt like to you one of the main themes of the book, like this gap between how we see ourselves and how we're perceived by other people, and the kind of pain of trying to close that gap or reconcile with that gap.
Yes. I mean, I think where I've landed is that I don't need to close the gap. But it took me a long time to get there. The gap is not my fault. I know who I am, and I invite people to meet me here. But if their perception doesn't match the reality of my experience, it's not my responsibility to help them get across that gap.
So this issue of identity ties back to the phoenix rising from the ashes comment that Ann Patchett made earlier. So she was referring to some of the controversy over American Dirt, which was your last book in 2020. Huge bestseller, Oprah Book Club club pick, a beloved novel about an undocumented mother and son fleeing cartel violence in Mexico to the US. Massive success. It also had some backlash about whether you were the right person to tell that story, representation in publishing. There was a New York Times story last week where you talked about how that controversy almost made you stop writing. And I know that that experience was painful, but what did you take away from it, and what got you able to start writing again?
You know, it took me probably a year before I even knew if I wanted to try, because that experience was more, by the way, I applaud you for the very succinct way that you summarized that prolonged dumpster fire that happened in my life. But it really was a very painful experience. And, you know, the thing about being a novelist is that if you're doing it right, you have to be incredibly vulnerable. And in the experience of writing American Dirt, I spent 5 years researching that novel. It was my fourth book, and I had published 3 books pretty quietly before, that probably no one in this room has heard of before American Dirt. And I expected that novel would be published in much the same way as the others. I wrote it because I believed that there was a humanitarian crisis at our border that no one was paying attention to. And here we are 5 years later, and there is a humanitarian crisis at our border that no one is paying attention to. I spent 5 years doing the research. I traveled through Mexico. I visited migrant shelters. I interviewed everyone I could find who was an expert in this field. I talked to humanitarian aid workers, the men and women running the shelters, lawyers who were representing unaccompanied kids, people who walk out in the desert and leave water in the places where people have died in hopes that people won't die in those places again. I talked to many, many migrants over 5 years of my life about their experiences. And then I wrote a book that I felt really proud of. And it was daunting. I will say 3.5 years into the writing of that novel, I had the experience that changed my whole life and the course of the book forever, which was that the week before the 2016 election, my mom and dad were out to dinner with a group of friends, and my dad died in the restaurant at the dinner table. And I have had a lot of trauma before that moment in my life. My first book is a memoir called A Rip in Heaven, which is about a double homicide that happened in my family when I was 16. But when my dad died, I realized that every trauma I had endured up to that moment, I had survived because of him. And I didn't know how to get through hard things without him. So the moment of his passing, right during the election in 2016, which was already a very dark time in the world, led me to like a very deep pit of despair. But then this miraculous thing happened. And I was angry at this book that I was writing, by the way, at that time, American Dirt, which was not working. I had 3.5 years worth of research and I was writing a bad book. And then a few months after my dad died, I just had this liberation. I was like, nothing else matters. So I may as well write the book that my dad would be proud of. And I wrote American Dirt. I started over from scratch. A couple months after my opening scene, I rented a casita in the desert in the borderlands in Arizona, and I wrote almost half the book in 10 days. I had been steeping in that research for 3 years, and now I had the catalyst of my grief to power the book. And so the experience of writing American Dirt was a deeply personal one. And the grief and the trauma that are in the book are mine. The story does not belong to me. The research does not belong to me. But it was a book that I opened a vein and bled into those pages. So the notion that it wasn't my book was even more painful given that backstory, given what was in those pages. And so the idea of returning to the well and like doing that vulnerability again when I know that there are people standing by with lemon juice and salt shakers, it was a very daunting prospect. I just didn't know if I wanted to try again. But ultimately, in the aftermath of that experience, I got invested in, I should say, I've been doing the work of sort of exploring my own identity privately for 30 years. No one should ever have to do it publicly. And I did. I was called to account for myself on the pages of every newspaper in the country. And so it led me to this place where I was very deeply invested in thinking about my identity and asking myself, how did I get here? How did I get from being that kid who was forbidden from speaking Spanish at home to being this woman who's being ridiculed for my broken Spanish and for pretending to be Latina? And that led me to thinking about my father and my grandmother and how it was we got here. And then I remembered that, for a writer, my vulnerability is my superpower. And I'm willing to do it again because this is how I interpret the world. And I'm sure there will be people who don't like it and who have something to say about it. And they are welcome to say those things, but not to me. I don't want to know. So that's how I ended up with this book.
So in that New York Times article from last week, Ann Patchett, who again has been a very strong friend and defender of yours, said that Jeanine found a way to make art out of her experience, but she made it into something loving instead of something full of rage. And this book it does have a lot of love in it. It seemed like it also reaffirmed your sense of importance about protecting free speech. You and I talked a little bit offline in terms of censorship pressure coming from both the right and the left, how important it is to protect freedom of speech, especially with encroaching authoritarianism. So would you, I guess, maybe talk about, would you ever think twice now about tackling certain topics or subjects, or do you disagree that anything should be off limits to writers?
Nothing should be off limits to writers. Thank you. That is the easiest question ever. I feel the need to shout this from the parapets right now because I think there are a lot of writers who are not comfortable saying it. People are worried in this climate about saying unpopular things. And we are in a landscape right now in the publishing world where people are afraid to write outside of their own lived experiences not least of all because of what happened to me after American Dirt. Nobody wants to be the next American Dirt. And I get it. I don't want to be the next American Dirt either. But I am worried. You know, when American Dirt came out in 2020, there were around 600 book bans that year. Last year, the number was over 10,000, and it included American Dirt. And while everyone in the book world is rightly outraged and appalled at those numbers, when there is a creeping censorship coming up on the left as well, no moral equivalency here. I don't want to get it twisted. Banning a book from a public high school is a very different thing than banning a book on Twitter. But there is more than one way to ban a book. And I just want to remind everybody that books are never the problem. Books are always the solution. And I feel as writers, especially in this moment of creeping authoritarianism on all sides, we have to have the absolute liberty to write whatever story moves in our hearts. And we have to take advantage of that liberty, as scary as it might be, as tempting as it is to stay with the safe subjects. My poor husband is like, can we please get a book about puppies? Please. People are afraid to write about subjects that are dicey. They are afraid to write about things that do not toe the party line. They are afraid to say things that are not popular with their political affiliation. That terrifies me. No one in this room should be afraid to say anything in the United States of America.
Well, we were talking too. I mean, there was a quote from a writer that we were talking about that if writers only were allowed to write about their own experiences, we would only have memoirs. We wouldn't have any fiction.
Right.
So, I mean, I think maybe though, and you and I talked about this, you talked about the research you did for American Dirt, that maybe behind the idea that anyone should be able to tell any story, there's probably a heightened responsibility if we're telling someone else's story. But I know you are describing the process, like if you're bringing care and research to that and,
Absolutely.
and honoring that story.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I also think that I just want to acknowledge that the impetus for this moment, it came from a place of goodness, right? It arrived because there was a need to reckon with inequality in the way we are telling stories, and the way we are publishing stories, and the way we are marketing stories in this country. There is a need for greater representation across the board in the publishing industry. And part of the fallout from American Dirt is that there has been a reckoning in the publishing industry, long overdue, with endeavoring to publish more diverse voices. I think it's currently in the sort of Band-Aid phase of the healing, because until we have more diverse voices inside the publishing houses, the efforts to publish more writers from diverse backgrounds are not always going to hit the mark. I think we really need to try to get more diverse voices inside the rooms where those decisions are being made.
So coming back to Speak to Me of Home, I mean, one of the things I loved is that you explored how identities change from one generation to the next. So what it means to be Puerto Rican, or even broader, what it means to be a woman, a spouse, the pressures and expectations that go with that can really change from one generation to the next. So it can kind of be like an experience where we're both women, but it was so different for you in the 70s than it is for me today, Mom. Like, you don't get it, or vice versa.
Yeah.
But the book talks about how important it is to be able to be open to each other's experiences, like you closing the gap. So I'm curious if writing it has helped you think differently about both your parents and your teenage daughters.
Yes, I think so. I think it also, I think one of the primary things it did for me was to allow me to find empathy for my grandmother. That was the generation that felt really, for me, outside of the empathy circle in my family. My dad was a really good dad. This book is dedicated to him, who fashioned bedrock out of sand, is the dedication. And the reason for that dedication is that he was a much better father than he had any business being. His childhood was a bad one. His mother was not a good mother. And it was a thing he never talked about. I know it was painful for him. And it wasn't until I had my own kids and I really started grappling with some of these questions, really writing this book and trying to fully inhabit some of the experiences of my grandmother's life, made me, like, for example, there's a story that shows up in the book, fictionalized, but it was based on a real thing that happened in my grandmother's life. My grandfather joined a country club in St. Louis and came home and announced that they were now members of this exclusive country club, and they were all excited. And the next day they went back to the country club and it was like, skrrr! Everyone was like, who's this now? When my grandmother came in with all of these mixed ethnicity children. And she was denied a locker in the women's locker room. That was the compromise that they gave her. They didn't want to upset the rest of the members. So she was given a locker in the staff room. And my grandmother spent, I think, the majority of her adult life. I don't remember ever eating a meal in a restaurant with her where she didn't send the meal back. And we were always so embarrassed by that when we were kids, but now I look back and I'm like, she was desperate to differentiate herself from the staff. She was so aghast she spent her whole life like, don't you know who I am? And when I started learning some of these things about her life that I didn't know before, or I didn't know them intimately, I was like, no wonder she was mad. You know, I would have been mad. I'm still mad. It didn't even happen to me. I would have been a bad mother. I would have been angry for the rest of my life, I think, if I was in Maria's situation. So writing this story and working through a lot of that stuff in fiction allowed me to create empathy for her in my heart that was not there before. It also, I think, I don't know if my daughters, I have 2 teenage daughters. I am in it, you guys. Whew. 18 and almost 15. Pray for me. I think writing the character of Daisy, she's the 3rd generation character in this novel. She's closer in age to my kids than she is to me. And I really love Daisy, and I think she's like an aspirational character for me because she shuns all social media and like she doesn't even want a cell phone. I'm like, look at her. Isn't this a great way aren't these great choices that Daisy is making? Did
you try to do that like with a wink wink to your kids?
Yeah,
like,
well, they'd have to read the book in order to get that messaging. But no, I think to be sure, the parent-child relationships in this book, and probably in all of my books, are really central to the themes of my writing, and it's because I have had such powerful parent-child relationships in my life. And I think it makes for incredibly fertile ground, especially, this is the first time I've written about mothers and daughters. Usually it's been cross-gender relationships between parents and children. So this was really fun to write all of these strong women at each other's throats all the time.
Well, you have a great quote. I'm going to read a couple sentences from the book because I just thought this would probably resonate with a lot of modern parents. The lesson motherhood was now teaching her was that it was no longer enough to placate your kid, even though when she was Charlie's age, no adult in her life would have dreamed of placating her. Ruth grew up, as all previous generations had done, for the breadth of human history at a time when kids were expected to appease their parents. But then, when it was her turn to be the parent, she discovered that in the space of a few years, the balance had tipped entirely. Her kids were not interested in appeasing her in the least. For Ruth and her peers, it was never going to be their turn. Yeah. Is that how it's felt at times?
Yes. That is how it feels. And then the next line or two, she says to her son, she reads this thing that she's baffled by, and then she like tries. She's like, I support you, honey. Whatever makes you happy. And that's not good enough. Charlie is like, what do you mean? And it seems like you don't understand. And she's like, I don't understand. But she's trying, right? She does not get credit for trying. He's like, and then she recognizes that it's not enough to just appease her child. She has to do it convincingly. She has to do it internally. She has to actually buy it. She has to. And yeah, I do think I look around sometimes and I'm like, what happened to us? My husband and I are pretty, my parents or my kids would say we're very strict parents. We're not permissive. They have to do their own laundry. They have to say please and thank you. But I feel like that's not a lot, you know? But they have rules and they have boundaries, and many of their peers do not. And so it's this constant push and pull between what we know to be correct, what we know to be right parenting, and also like not wanting to raise complete weirdos. Because I'm like, I know that everyone around them is doing this, so even though I really feel like this is the right thing, do I want my kid to be a complete outlier? It's trying to find the balance between those things that is really challenging. And we're not always getting it right. But I think it's really interesting to note that this has all happened, and I blame the internet. Because generational wisdom is suddenly meaningless. This is the first time in human history where the kids are like, I don't need your wisdom. I'll ask Google. Thank you very much. I have all the answers right here. So we have nothing to offer them. So then God help you if you say, like, I'm not sure your TikTok research is valid. I think you might need a little more insight on this. Like, let's drill down a little bit. And they just roll their eyes, you know?
Oh. Well, I want to go back to an issue that you mentioned earlier, which is this idea of passing or assimilating, how immigrants feel pressured either internally or externally into wanting to be white or wanting to be perceived as quote-unquote normal or American. And I think what grieves me so much reading and thinking about this is how often those conversations are driven by this kind of oppressive societal pressure to be homogenous, and how cruel people can be when we aren't homogenous. But also and you see this in your book, when people do comply, there's so much beautiful culture and food and art and individuality that's lost in that process.
Yeah.
So how have you grappled with this concept of passing or assimilation?
You know, I'm still learning the language. I'm Generation X, and we did not grow up with the language of, millennials. It's like their absolute birthright to declare not only like who they are, but also they will tell you who you are, you know? And that was not a natural thing for me, so that when, in the aftermath of American Dirt, lots of people had an opinion about my identity, I did not know how to push back. And I thank the millennials for teaching me, because I really do. now I feel so like the sort of confidence that I think I was lacking my entire life because my identity felt confusing or complicated, and I didn't know how to articulate it all the time. I did allow for a big portion of my life, certainly all of my childhood, for other people to determine my identity. And it probably was not until the fallout of American Dirt that I started asking myself the question, like, is there something artificial about the way that I am experiencing my identity? And like, no, there is not. There is not. But it took me a long time to get there. And the reason it took me a long time to get there was because my grandmother was successful in her efforts to shame her children into passing. And that is, we never talked about it. And it's a painful thing to contend with. But I also think that it is there's a scene in the book where we have these three generations, Rafaela, Ruth, and Daisy. But Rafaela's parents have the names that my great-grandparents had. They are called Mamma Mia and Papa Mio. And they are known by those names in the book because they are only known as parents and grandparents. And there's a scene in the book where Mamma Mia is being called on to declare her race to the census taker. And he's like, "Are you black or white?" And she's like, "What a ridiculous question." Anyone with eyeballs in Puerto Rico can see that it's not a binary. It is a beautiful spectrum. And I fall into this position on the spectrum. And the census taker nods his head and then records her as mulata. He decides for her. He's like, "Okay, thank you for that. Anyway, I see what you are." So even then, even 3 generations, 4 generations ago in Puerto Rico, where you had a United States census taker coming, insisting on recording the ethnicity of the people of the island, there were 3 choices. And up until the year 2010, 80% of Puerto Rican people identified as white. Because the only alternative was black. And they did not feel that that represented their identity. So that was the thing that I sort of wanted to get into and contend with as well. I think that identity is important. It's very important, but it's not paramount. And I think that the ways that we are conducting the conversation around identity in this country right now are extremely reductive, counterproductive, and just unhelpful, as well as making lots of people feel like I don't belong anywhere because I cannot identify myself in these checkboxes. Or rather, I would have to fill out way too many of these checkboxes to identify myself. And I just think there's something, I think the whole beauty of fiction is in the nuance. It's in the gray areas, in the details. And I think that trying to insist on a binary in these ways is not the work of, it's not where fiction belongs.
Well, I mean, speaking of the way that we make people feel in this country, you mentioned earlier that your husband is an Irish immigrant, was undocumented for many years, is now a citizen. So you've obviously had that experience as a family of how that impacted you. Obviously, there are a wide range of immigration experiences, but collectively, we seem to be in a pretty dark place right now in terms of how we're talking about immigrants generally in this country, demonizing them, othering them in darker situations, arresting, depriving them of rights, deporting them without due process. How, especially given your background and your family, how are you feeling about our climate around immigration right now?
I mean, it could not be worse. It almost literally could not be worse. It's like a hellscape. It feels dire, absolutely dire. I will tell you, there was a moment in like probably 2018, 2019, where my husband had applied for his citizenship, but it had not come through yet. He was undocumented for over 10 years. He got a green card after we were married, and then eventually he applied for citizenship. And it was during Trump's first term. He was like, I think I should probably apply for citizenship. I was like, that's a good idea. So we did that. And then during the period where we were waiting to hear back from the citizenship application, his green card lapsed. So there was a period of about a year when we had a whole life, 2 daughters, a dog, a home, a business, and he was back to being undocumented. And it had been scary when we were young, but we also went skydiving when we were young. It's like you do scary, stupid things all the time, and you're like, it'll be fine. But we were in a different position then, and I remember during that time, we traveled to Arizona. And if you guys are familiar with Arizona, you know that the Border Patrol is ubiquitous there, and they do not stay in the borderlands. They are like 50, 100 miles from the border. And I knew from my research in Mexico, when I was writing American Dirt, that it was a felony to tell a Border Patrol agent that you were a citizen if you are not. And I knew that because I attended a wedding at the Parque de la Amistad, Friendship Park, the most misnamed park in the world, which is at the US-Mexico border with a giant fence down the middle of it. A bride and groom got married there. He was a United States Marine. Her 3 children were United States citizens. She was an undocumented Mexican woman who had been pulled over by a Border Patrol agent who asked her, are you a citizen? And in her moment of panic, she said yes, which was a felonious statement, and that woman has a lifetime ban. She can never come back to this country where her husband is a US Marine and her children are citizens. So she had her wedding at the border fence so that her family from both sides could attend the wedding. So when we got pulled over by Border Patrol in Arizona, my undocumented husband and I said to him, as the agent was approaching our car, do not say a word. I will answer. And he came right up to the car and he said, are you folks citizens? And I said, yes, we are. And I lied right through my teeth. And he said, he looked in the Jeep and he saw our 2 white faces. And he said, you folks have a nice day. And he left. And I, again, had to reckon with our incredible privilege. If he had my grandmother's last name, or an accent, or skin that was a different color, he would not be here today. So I think I always knew that we were not the undocumented family they were looking for. It has been illustrated to me over and over again. It is still true that no matter where you come from, being undocumented is an objectively terrifying way to live. But we have been incredibly lucky, and we are protected by privilege in many instances.
This is why I think stories are so important, though, because especially whenever you have a group that's being dehumanized, and I'm thinking of Arab Americans after 9/11, what we're dealing with immigration right now in the country. I think it's especially important to read as much as you can, both fiction and nonfiction, from those perspectives, to kind of keep that humanity front and center. And I think you're doing this with your books. It's not just a nameless group of people. It's Ruth, it's Daisy, it's Carlos, it's Lydia. It's humanized. These stories.
This is the one great magic of fiction that I know lots of novelists, it's like unfashionable to admit that I always have an ulterior motive when I write a book, but I do, always. I'm trying to convince you of something. It's usually something that I'm angry about, or a thing that I feel like people aren't paying close enough attention to, or I hope to engender a notion where we could have a more productive conversation about something. I do think that the great magic of fiction is that, for example, with American Dirt, it's very difficult to have any kind of meaningful dialogue around immigration, because the very first thing you have to do is choose a noun. When you're talking to someone about immigration, you're going to talk about either migrants or immigrants or undocumented people or aliens or illegals or refugees. And whatever noun you choose to begin your conversation, that is like your flag in the ground, here are my politics. And then like the shutter rolls down between you. There's no room to actually have a meaningful conversation, because you're already predicting where the other person is coming from and like constructing your arguments against them. So the great thing about a novel that digs into these subjects is that you don't have to choose a noun. They're already there for you. They are Lydia and Luca, Rebecca and Soledad. And we don't have to label them. We can just talk about their humanity. And so I love that as being one of the really magical things that I think fiction can do.
I think in addition to parents and children, if you're a sibling, I think there are a lot of scenes in this book that really hit home. There's just some humorous scenes where they're like tag teaming their mom, trying to like texting each other, like, don't say that, you're pissing her off. Which I relate a lot to those. How two siblings can react very differently to similar circumstances. Even the kind of morbid sense of humor that you often develop together. There's a scene where a woman is having an imaginary conversation with her dead sister at the sister's funeral, and just their kind of humor with each other reminded me of me and my sister. How did your siblings help influence those scenes?
Yeah, I think a lot. My siblings and I are very close. As we have gotten older, we are more and more different. But I mentioned earlier, we had a trauma when we were teenagers. My brother was the only surviving victim of a crime in which my two cousins, sisters, Julie and Robin Carey, were raped and killed, and in St. Louis, Missouri. And they were thrown off a bridge into the Mississippi River. And my brother was also forced off the bridge into the river. And we had always been a close family in our childhood up to that time. But the experience of going through that trauma together was like cement. And I think I even say that in this book, that they have a grief, a big trauma in their lives, and the experience of it is like cement. It makes their bonds feel so much stronger. You become so protective of each other after you go through an experience like that together. And you begin to understand that there are ways in which your shorthand operates with each other that no one else in the world will ever understand. And it's a great gift. It's a beautiful thing. And I see it now with my own daughters when they're not murdering each other, that they are developing this way, and sometimes it drives me crazy because they use it against me, and I see them just look at each other and I'm like, what was that? What are you saying? What are you transmitting about me with your eyes? But I think in strong families, that is, it is always there. Sometimes it's not a sibling, maybe it's a cousin, or an aunt, or someone. But when you have those really powerful family relationships, that kind of, And even Ruth in this book, she's the middle generation character. When she goes to college, she has the experience of growing up in St. Louis and very much assimilating. And she feels it, but she's like a very determined optimist at all times and just wants to be happy. So it's really not until she goes to college that she begins to contend with like what she may have lost by assimilating. And she meets a boy who becomes her first Puerto Rican friend. And that relationship is so powerful and so meaningful to her. And largely it's because of that kind of shorthand. It's because he understands her experiences. And she feels that she's been trying all of her life to try to find the means to express her experiences and make people understand who she is and what it felt like being a Puerto Rican kid growing up in a white community in the Midwest. And suddenly she meets a boy that she doesn't have to explain it to him. He knows. And he like finishes her sentences about it. And it's the most exhilarating and seductive thing ever.
Well, I have just a question or two more, and then we're going to open it up to the audience for questions. So be thinking if you would like to ask Jeanine a question. We don't have the normal roaming mics that we would have at the Opera House, so you'll just need to, raise your hand, and then I'll repeat it into the microphone. If you project a little bit to me. So think about that, and I have a final question or two, and we'll go to the audience. So one of my all-time favorite authors is Mary Oliver. And I was so excited to see that this book starts with a Mary Oliver quote. It was just so nice to open it and see that. It's from a poem very fittingly called Hurricane, because a hurricane plays an important part of the events in the book. But the quote that you start the book with reads, "But listen now to what happened to the actual trees. Toward the end of that summer, they pushed new leaves from their stub limbs. It was the wrong season, yes, but they couldn't stop." What made you choose that quote for the book?
Oh, it's so emotional. Just hearing you read it. I think that quote means so many different things to me. I could not stop writing. Although, a big part of me is like, why would you do this again? I pushed new leaves from my branches because even though it may be the wrong season, I couldn't stop. But also, I think this is the story of Puerto Rico in a nutshell. Here is a place that is repeatedly abused by its neighbor and by the weather. It is repeatedly abandoned of help when it needs help. And what has been the response of Puerto Rico but to become this magical, self-sufficient place? I don't want to romanticize it. I don't want to let the United States off the hook. But Puerto Rico cannot stop reimagining itself, growing, and being made new. And nor should it.
Well, a final related question, I think just this idea of capturing joy. You and I talked about this. We had a chance to have dinner last night, and we talked about it. We were talking about memory loss because there's a character in the book who's dealing with memory loss. And you've mentioned people in your life that are dealing with that as well. And this idea that when that is happening, when someone is slowly losing their memory over time, that every day that you have is as good as it's going to get because it's going to decline from there. And that could probably be true of our lives generally. I mean, all of us in here tonight, we're never going to be any younger than we are today. So just keep that in mind. But even politically, whatever is going on in the country, however dark it feels, there's still a real need to have joy. I mean, you talked about that. So tell me a little bit about how you still find and experience joy.
Well, for example, you may have noticed that my pants match my book cover. I find joy in the silly things. I think there was a moment, perhaps 3 years ago, when I started to emerge from the darkness, and I recognized, someone recently asked me which book was the most fun. This is my 5th book. Which book did I have the most fun writing? And I went through them all one at a time, and I was like, it was definitely not that one. It wasn't, nope, not that. And I realized it was this one, definitely. This book reminded me that writing can be fun. And I needed that. I feel like I have described to you guys this evening a couple of the difficult moments of my life. There have been many more. And I came to a place in my late 40s where I said to myself, I have been sad long enough. I don't want to be sad anymore. I don't want to grieve. Every day that joy is available to me, I will reach for it. And it's not always available, but most days it is. And I intend to find it. I am going for it every day. And that is how you win at life, right? You find the joy in the darkest times. You refuse to let the darkness be the thing that drives your days. I don't want to be sad anymore. I have had a lot of grief in my life, and I have a lot more coming. So on the days that I am not faced with immediate grief, like I want to stop and look at flowers. I want to read beautiful books. I want to visit museums. I want to laugh with my kids. I want to take my dogs for a walk. I want to do all the things that make me happy. And I don't think there's anything irresponsible about being happy in this climate. Quite the opposite. I think we need to fill our cups so that they runneth over, so that we have the energy to fight the good fight, because we need to fight the good fight.
Okay, so we're going to open it up to the audience if there are any questions. And again, if you can just read and project, and I'll repeat it because we also have live stream viewers, so I'll repeat it for them. Go ahead, right there. Yep. What book brought you the most joy?
Oh my goodness, what a great question. I mean, I don't know if this is the right answer, but the first thing that popped into my head was the book No Mud, No Lotus by Thich Nhat Hanh. It is a great book. It's a very slim volume and like 60 pages. That book will teach you how to be okay when nothing feels okay. It is, so I don't know if joy is the right word, but it definitely helped me find peace at a time when peace was in very short supply. It's a book that I have found myself recommending over and over and over again to people who are in crisis or who are in trauma or grief. No Mud, No Lotus.
Could you just say the title one more time?
The title is No Mud, No Lotus by Thich Nhat Hanh. Don't ask me to spell it.
Do we have any other questions? I'm sure there has to be more questions, yes.
List of critics, where do your kids stand?
On a list of critics, where do your kids stand?
They are very low on the list. I'm proud to report that my kids are supporters of mine. They're very proud of me. They have not finished this book. And I'm like, every day I'm like, are we reading this evening at all? Your quiz is coming up soon. You better, but no, the kids are, they were old enough to understand some of what happened around the publication of American Dirt. They were old enough to appreciate Ms. Oprah Winfrey. But they were not old enough to understand it, and frankly, neither was I at that time. But they are very, very excited for me that I have a new book, that I got to this point. It feels like a triumph that I even wrote the book, never mind what happens with it, that I have regained my voice, that I feel like this book has returned a vital part of myself to me, which is that I am able to declare myself in the world. And that is such a gift. And I think my kids don't care at all if I'm actually a good writer or not. They're just happy that I'm back to being happy.
Any other questions? Yes?
Have you been able to take your kids to Puerto Rico or to
Claro que sí, los ambos.
Sorry, just for the live stream viewers, the question was, have you been able to take your kids to either Puerto Rico or to Ireland?
Yes, they have been to both places. They are very lucky kids. They love both islands, and it brings me so much joy to see them absorbing the relationship between the islands in me, in the person of their mother. The two islands do have a lot in common culturally: family, music, dancing, Catholicism. There are some very strong bonds there between those two island cultures. And then there are many, many, many ways in which they are not at all similar. One funny story my father was a musician as well. He played every instrument. He started on the accordion when he was a little boy, and he played everything. When we were growing up, we were like the very nerdy kids who used to sing folk songs after dinner instead of watching Three's Company, which was not allowed in our house. But every St. Patrick's Day, my father would come to my elementary school with his guitar, and he would sing Irish folk songs at the elementary school wearing a guayabera and a Kangol. And I thought, well, that must be the traditional garb of the Irish folk singer. It was not until years later that I was like, hang on 1 second. That is not what Irish folk singers wear. That is what Puerto Rican men wear to Mass on Sundays. So it's been a lot of fun in my adult life as well, sort of an adventure to try to unpack the different elements of my identity. And I'm like, oh, this piece is Puerto Rican. There's a lot of that discovery in this book as well, where Daisy, who moves back to Puerto Rico, was raised on the East Coast of the United States, starts to recognize little cultural things in the Puerto Rican people that she always thought were particular to her family. Like when she asks her mother a question and her mother doesn't hear her. Let me see if the Boricua's in the... And the mother's like, instead of saying what, she goes with her nose. What did you say? That means, what did you say? Repeat the question. Daisy starts to recognize all of these little sort of cultural touchstones that she thought were just peculiar to her family, and she sees them all around her in Puerto Rico, and she starts to sort of recognize certain elements of herself. And she's like, oh, that's where that came from. And I've had that experience throughout my adult life, and it has been a great journey of discovery and a lot of fun. And so I really love taking my kids to Puerto Rico and to Ireland and allowing them to have those discoveries a little earlier in life than I had them. Yeah, thank you.
We have a question over here. Where is your husband from in Ireland?
He's from the West Coast, Mayo. Yeah, it's really beautiful. If you guys have ever been to Ireland, or if you visit Ireland, I highly recommend going to Mayo. A lot of his family lives in Galway now, which is about an hour away. And Galway is a much bigger city. It's very lively. But Mayo is just absolutely beautiful. It is the greenest place you will ever be until you go to El Yunque in Puerto Rico.
Other questions? Yes, right here in front.
Yeah.
So she was asking, your father's represented in the book. What was the voice of your mother represented in the book?
My mom is not so much in this book. My mom has been a strong presence in some of my other books. The Crooked Branch, there was a relationship in that novel that was very much drawn from the relationship with my mom. This novel being an exploration largely of the identity on my father's side of the family is very much in conversation with who my dad was. So, it's funny. It wasn't until, again, this is something I learned as an adult. My brother and sister and I grew up when we were young. We always identified as Irish and Puerto Rican. I still do that. I always say I'm Irish and Puerto Rican. That's my identity. It's not, actually. My mom is a white American, estadounidense. She's a United Statesian. She has heritage of her own, but it's so distant. It didn't really factor into our ways of experiencing our mother culturally. And it wasn't until probably like sometime in the last 10 years of my life, having a conversation with a very smart, well-educated, mixed-race friend of mine, who we were talking about this, and I was like, I don't know why we all do that. We just completely discard my mother's ethnicity, and we adopt the ethnicity of my father. We've done this our whole lives. My poor mom. She's like, what about me? And we're like, it's terrible. But my friend said to me, it's very common for mixed race or mixed ethnicity kids to adopt the ethnicity of whoever they identify as the nurturer in their family. And that was my dad. My dad was the maternal one. My mother is a great mother. She's a wonderful mother. She's not necessarily emotionally available. My dad, thank God, took after the Puerto Rican side of his family in this way, rather than the Irish side, who were extremely reserved emotionally. He was very emotionally available. So he was the one that we had all of our sort of emotional interchange with. My mom worked very hard, loved us very much, and was like harried all the time, but was not necessarily going to like sit down and talk to you about her feelings. And my dad did. So that was a gift. And I think it's part of the reason that we identify that way. In the aftermath of American Dirt, I have had to adjust the way that I express that, because I understand that it feels important to other people. But this is part of the gap that I talked about earlier. It's not important to me. The DNA, the percentage, doesn't matter. These were the cultures of my childhood. These were the elements of my heritage that presented themselves in meaningful ways in my life. And that's who I am. So.
Yes, over here.
I know you've only just finished this book, but I was wondering, of the snippets that fall onto the editing floor, are there any that you say, ooh, that would be good, and that one there, and that one there, to thread into thoughts for the next investigation of the book?
Sorry, just real quick, was there anything that didn't make it into this book or maybe got edited out that might be an idea you explore in a future book?
That's a really interesting question. I do keep a document every time I'm writing a novel called Cuts. And whenever I find a scene that's not working, I do not just delete it. I cut it and paste it into this other document just in case. And sometimes when I'm working on a revision, I will come to a place where I'm like, that scene that I wrote in that other draft that wasn't working, I think I could repurpose it and fit it in here, and it's what this what this part of the book needs now. And so I will go back and use the cuts in that way. But I have never gone back to the cuts after the book is out and explored for other stories. And I think the reason is because I'm already thinking about the next book, and it will be probably a year before I can even say a single coherent sentence about it. But I have the germ of an idea that is beginning to take root in my head, and it is so far distant from what this book was that I don't imagine I will come back to those cuts. But you never know, and I think it's a really interesting idea. Yeah.
Have any of your books been optioned, or are there any that you kind of hope might become films one day?
American Dirt was optioned. The film rights reverted to me a few months ago. I could sell them again. I don't know if I will. I had a lot of movie option offers for Rip in Heaven, and I chose not to sell the movie rights to that book because I didn't want to see a film adaptation of what happened to my family on the screen. It was too brutal. But yeah, all the others are for sale. So if anyone here...
You guys can go negotiate with Jeanine in the lobby afterwards. And speaking of that, we have just maybe a time for one or two more questions, and then we can let you guys go. Maybe you'll have a chance to chat with Jeanine or get your book personalized. Are there any? Yeah, right here. How would you describe your craft or your process in just a sentence?
Hot mess. I will say 5 books in, I do not know how to write a novel. It's different every time. I still don't know how to do it, but I think that's why it works. I think if it becomes too predictable of a process, the book won't be good. Maybe that's that's probably terrible. It's like anyway, I won't make a bad metaphor, but I'm sure there are healthier ways to go about this, but I do not know what they are. I'm sorry.
Maybe one, yeah, oh, actually, we'll do 2 more. How about we'll do these last 2? Diana, yes?
A lot of themes tonight about resilience and also relationships. As one of the closing thoughts tonight, would you give us your perspective on the importance of relationships to our own resilience?
So she said, we've talked a lot about resilience and relationships tonight. Could you talk about the importance of resilience to our own relationships? Or
Relationships.
importance of relationships to our resilience?
This is like maybe my favorite question of all time.
Good question.
Because I will tell you why. I had such a hard time after American Dirt came out. I don't want to dwell on that. I don't want to be maudlin about it, but it was brutal. That experience was incredibly painful. And it was absolutely the existence of female friendships in my life, new female friendships, the heroic women who swooped in, many of whom had experience enduring similar problems in their lives, walking through fire with their head held high. Those women came into my life and taught me how to be okay. I would not have survived this experience without Miss Oprah Winfrey, Ann Patchett. These women saved me. And then my husband was he's like a saint among men. I don't know how he... I'm a lot. And he never gets... He's so patient with me. When my father died, I met him when I was in my 20s, and you don't look for the right things when you're in your 20s. I was like, he's got to make me laugh, and he has to be really good looking. What a recipe for disaster. Thank God I got lucky. I did not ask myself if he would be a good father. I didn't ask well, maybe I did. I think I recognized that we had kindred values, right? But I wasn't asking myself those questions in an overt way. It was subconscious. I think what I did not know about him until we were neck deep in the marriage was that he would have infinite patience for my grief. That when my dad died, he would say to me, there is no expiration date on how you're feeling. And I tested that. Because it was 2 years later, other people were like, are you still sad? And I'm like, well, my dad is still dead, so yes. But he never made me feel like I needed to get over it. None of the difficulties of my life, of my adult life, has he been impatient about. That is everything. Having that sort of stalwart support, that safety net, those people who watch you in your worst moments and are there to catch you and make you be okay again. That is everything. That is the whole point of being a human on Earth, honestly. What a great question. Thank you.
Good girlfriends, kind partners. Those are the recipe. That's the recipe right there. Final question right over here. Did you have your hand up before? There was a final question over here. Okay, I think she's letting Diana and Diana's amazing question be the final question. So what we're going to do, thank you guys so much for being here tonight. We're going to stand up and take a photo with you guys holding your book up so we can help Jeanine promote this amazing book. And then we'll let everyone meet Jeanine.
Thank you for joining us for this special presentation from the National Writers Series. Coming up Thursday, May 29th at 7 p.m., don't miss an evening with #1 New York Times bestselling author Carl Hiaasen. Hiaasen, author of Bad Monkey, returns with his latest novel, Fever Beach, a darkly funny, razor-sharp satire set in the chaotic heart of contemporary Florida. The novel follows a bumbling extremist, a savvy divorcee, and a hot-tempered environmentalist as they collide in a wild mystery involving corruption, dark money, and absurd political ambition. Known for his biting wit and unforgettable characters, Hiaasen has authored 14 best-selling novels and 6 acclaimed children's books. Tickets are available now. Go to nationalwriterseries.org.